How's it going, everybody? Mike here with the Social Life of Language, making complex theory simple but never simplified. If you think that sounds cool, hit that subscribe button now. Today we'll be looking at an article by Gershon titled "Breaking Up is Hard to Do, Media Switching and Media Ideologies." And we're going to focus on those two key words, media switching and media ideologies. Let's take that first key word, media switching. And here we'll use Gershon's example from the movie He's Just Not That Into You. While we watch, we might want to think about how this is analogous to what we might go through today.
I had this guy leave me a voicemail at work, so I called him at home. And then he emailed me to my BlackBerry, and so I texted to his cell, and then he emailed me to my home account, and the whole thing just got out of control. And I miss the days where you had one phone number and one answering machine. And now you just have to go around checking all these different portals just to get rejected by 7 different technologies. It's exhausting.
Oh boy. Has anyone gotten dumped, then gotten dumped again on Facebook when their status changes to single? And then your friend is like, OMG, look at their Instagram right now. Who is that? I really don't care. I'm over it. I'm so over it. Now at this point, you gotta figure out a way how to dump them back. But then they unfriend you on Facebook. Ugh. They won. Basically, nowadays you get dumped 17 times minimum per breakup. Nevertheless, those are examples of media switches. So breaking up is really complicated, and Gershon takes us deep into how this happens, into why this happens in certain ways, and what beliefs, attitudes, and strategies shape the way we put media to use in our everyday lives. Those beliefs, attitudes, and strategies constitute what we might call media ideologies. Now, we might not always say these things out loud, but when we analyze conversations about using different forms of media, we start noticing some similarities and differences between what people say they do with media, what they think media is for, or what it's good for, or what it's not good for, and then there's what people actually do with media. But first, I want to take this time to remind everybody that when we say we're talking about media, we are not only talking about screens and emails and social media. We are talking about mediums or forms that we communicate through. For example, a happy birthday text is a medium. A happy birthday card is another medium. But importantly, each medium brings with it a lot of baggage. We feel a different way about a birthday text in comparison to, let's say, a birthday card. We might think a birthday card is more special, which themselves are sort of like extra messages that kind of tag along with the birthday card. At the same time, someone might think it's really old-fashioned, or they might get offended that the person just didn't call them on the phone, for example. Or how about just a face-to-face visit? Why don't you just come over and tell me happy birthday? We can think of all that extra baggage, all those extra messages that tag along as part of what constitutes our media ideologies. Now for the first really important point. Media ideologies shape but do not determine what we do in everyday life. They might tend to promote a certain behavior over another, but ultimately they do not determine what a person does. A perfect example of this is that people generally believe a face-to-face breakup is the morally right thing to do. But none of the relationships in this article necessarily use the face-to-face approach in isolation. In fact, many of these stories were about how people switched mediums, which made different outcomes possible. Sometimes what they wanted and other times what they didn't want to happen. Now here we get to another key word, affordance, which we can quickly define as possibilities, constraints, and likelihoods produced by an environment. For example, you walk into a doctor's office. In that environment, you'll probably sit down on a chair. You'll probably lower the volume of your voice. You're probably not gonna sit on the floor. But we can also talk about digital environments or media environments. So, for example, if we're talking about phones, it makes possible the ability to talk to someone that is across the world. On the other hand, it constrains communication to only audio. So in this article, we're talking about affordances produced by media environments, which afford or maybe promote certain outcomes. It promotes certain possibilities, constraints, and likelihoods, which are produced or enhanced by any particular form of media or any particular medium. So what we see in these articles is people switching mediums, at times very strategically because they know different mediums afford different possibilities. On page 396, Gershon found that students might understand "it's over" text as the equivalent of "we need to talk" for hours and hours. Or if you really want to break up with someone, then making the breakup Facebook official, like changing your status to single, then you know it's done. For real. But other students would purposefully use certain mediums to obscure the definiteness of a particular message. For example, sending texts that could potentially be read as flirty. I had fun today. Like, a lot of fun. Now, at times, it's difficult to interpret text messages. Everybody knows that. But on page 400, and my favorite example from this whole article, we see a woman named Audrey who couldn't tell she was actually in a fight with her partner in person, in real life. While she was pretty sure she could have been able to tell they were in a fight if the conversation had taken place through text. She says, and I went, wait, are we in a fight? And yes, we were. We were in a fight and I had no idea. You can talk to someone online, but you don't get the emotional inflection. Sometimes if you know them really well, you can hear them saying those things. And sometimes you get the emotional inflection between the way they write and the speed at which they write it, or like the phrasing. So we're pretty quick to believe that we get less information through texting. But I think that we can totally call that a media ideology. But we should remember that media ideologies shape but do not determine what we do in everyday life. They shape but do not determine how we interpret things, because we're dealing with real people whose media ideologies might not necessarily align all the time. In some cases, they explicitly do not align. That brings me to one more major point. Media ideologies never work in isolation. They work together with many other media ideologies, with many other social ideologies. A really good example of this is how people started creating a side account on Instagram, or a Finsta, or a fake Instagram. Now, this is a media practice that overlaps with social ideologies about gender. For example, when it comes to women's Instagrams, there might be more pressure to produce witty or pretty or likable content. Basically, gender appropriate content. This is a media ideology. But we can also see how likable content overlaps with beliefs about how women should behave in public, or what is appropriate public behavior. So some women, of course not exclusively women, started making these side accounts on Instagram to share pictures with friends that you couldn't necessarily share with everyone. Candid pictures, or funny pictures, or ugly pictures. But even these Finstas come with their own media ideologies. For example, thou shalt not screenshot thy neighbor's Finsta. So overall, this article walks us through so many scenarios, and we get to see the way people talk about those beliefs, attitudes, and strategies when using media. We see that many ideologies work together and overlap. We see that the form of the medium shapes the message. And we see that sometimes we share similar media ideologies, and sometimes we don't. So that's all for today, folks. A big thanks to my patrons for supporting this channel. I'm Mike, and you're watching The Social Life of Language. And we're done.